Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our talk this afternoon, and a welcome to our Zoom audience as well, watching from afar. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce Ian Yonge to you. Ian is a retired solicitor, but he's been a volunteer at Petworth House for the last 10 years. And so it's his interest, and he'll be able to tell us about the house, its grounds, and its story. So Ian, a great welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been told I've got to stand here all the time or be out of camera range. So if I begin to go walkabout, let me know. Ducal Mansion, House of Art and Brownian landscape. I heard somebody talking earlier about the term Brownian landscape, why I hadn't referred to Cape Ridley Brown. The reason for that is it will go on to another line. Okay, let's begin. Now we're all familiar with that view of Petworth House. It has always looked like that. The original building, or the oldest building at Petworth, is a chapel. The chapel, the window arches in the chapel go back to the 1300s, there and there. But the wood decoration, the wood furnishings are about 1700. And you notice a gallery up there. And can you see the coat of arms there? Just in the middle. Those are the coat of arms of the Duke of Somerset, who did the wood effects in about 1700. And he was called the Proud Duke. He's very arrogant, very pompous, very proud of his own family lineage. So the two angels there are not supporting Christ, they are supporting the coat of arms of the Duke of Somerset. That's what it was all about with him. Now, you might wonder why we've got a chapel at Petworth as the parish church is 200 yards away. Probably three reasons for that. The first one is the neighbouring lord had a chapel, you needed one too. The second one, the lord could attend a religious service without meeting the common people. And lastly, they believed in medieval times that if you spent money on church building, you were more likely to go to heaven. And bearing in mind how the Percy family conducted their lives, their chances of going to heaven were pretty well zero. So bit of chapel building didn't come amiss at all. The story of Petworth is very much the story of the Percy family. The Percy family came over to England 1 year after the Norman conquest. They weren't at the Battle of Hastings. They only were given a small amount of land by King William up in Yorkshire. They had no connection with Petworth at all. And time went by until the early 1300s when Agnes Percy was the last surviving member of the family. And she married the Count of Louvain, and the Percy emblem is there. All right. Just there, the Percy emblem there. Previous to that marriage, the Count of Louvain had been given Petworth as a wedding present or present. And the wording below the coat of arms there says that they would adopt the name Percy. So the Percy male line had died out. Agnes Percy, the only one left, but their children adopted the name Percy. So from that point, the Percy family owned Petworth, but they didn't live here. Their main interests were in Yorkshire and Northumberland. This is just part of their property portfolio. Now, interesting, what we've got there is a pulpit facing in two directions, which is very unusual. The chapel is missing quite a lot of what you might expect to find in a conventional church. There's no organ, there's no font, but here we've got a double-sided pulpit. How it worked, the minister would be, right? The minister would be here speaking to the congregation across, saying the meek shall inherit the earth. And then that one, the minister will be directing his eyes up to Duke of Somerset in the gallery up there. He's already inherited the earth. So he gets a rather different message. Now, Petworth House in 1610. This is taken from a drawing of 1610, a rather complicated drawing, and they simplified it down. So what we've got here is the chapel there. If you're familiar with Petworth, that crenellated building there is more or less where the Red Room is now. And the chapel dates to the 1300s, and we believe that the Red Room also dates to the 1300s, because you notice there's battlements at the top there. And Piers Gaveston, who was the boyfriend of Edward II, at that time there was a lot of trouble in the country, and the Earl of Northumberland, who owned Petworth, was given the right to crenellate Petworth. So those two buildings date to about 1300. This extension here is later. Petworth started off as a tiny manor house of no consequence at all. For various reasons, which I'll come to later, it became the home of the Earls of Northumberland. So gradually it got extended along there. That is part of the early Stuart house. Not many people are familiar with that. It's easily accessible by the public. When you're going to the chapel down the corridor, you turn a little bit to your right. Petworth now looks like a grand house, all unified, all built in about 1700, but it's not like that at all. There's a Stuart building there, and that is the remains of that. It's now in the interior of the house. It gives an idea of what Petworth would have looked like in about 1610 period. Now that was what Petworth, I showed you a picture earlier of Petworth, just the chapel, the red room, crenellated building, and little extension. Now it is looking totally different 20 years later. We've got a huge extension there. The house runs further along there, and we've got a huge stable block there. What happened? Well, I'll talk more about that later, but what happened is the Earls of Northumberland, rather than just owning Petworth, came to live here. Petworth wasn't a home fit for an earl, so it had to be altered and extended. So that L-shaped extension there, that is totally gone now. There's nothing left of it at all, except when you're walking from the pleasure grounds into the park, if you look to your right, there remains a few foundations, but otherwise it's totally gone. That stable block there had accommodation for 100 horses, and it had running water there. So if you were a horse belonging to the Earl of Northumberland, you're probably better treated than if you're one of his tenant farms. So all that's changed now. That's Petworth Town, 1610. There's the house that we were looking at earlier. That's the road along there, and that's the road that leads to Haslemere. There are quite a lot of houses along that road. There are more houses along there now than there are now. But they've all gone now, and that's kind of parkland there. It's a very interesting map of 1610, but actually quite unreliable in a way. There are lots of fields here, and if you look at it in detail, it has one field 5 acres, and another field marked 2 acres, but the 2 acre field is bigger than the 5 acre field. So it's a very confusing and difficult map to follow. It is an interesting account of what the town looked like at that time. I'm not quite sure what those animals are in the park, some kind of livestock. The L would have been going like that along there. So that's the main block, and it would have run along that way. It ran right into the park. Petworth 1750 is looking very different now. What's happened is we've now got a Baroque mansion. I've got a more detailed picture of that in a moment. I've got this slide here because I wanted to show you that. Are you familiar with Lawn Hill, a number of you? That is Lawn Hill at Petworth. Doesn't look like a hill at all. It's squared off, it's got terrace there, it's got fountains, it's got statues, it's got benches. It's a very formal, elaborate garden. What happened is that when the house was remodeled early 1600s, they got a gardener to design the gardens. He made a very formal, elaborate garden, a very French-style garden. That fell out of favour after a bit, and Capability Brown came along. And this picture shows what the garden looked like a year or two probably before Capability Brown came. So a very formal, squared-off garden there, more garden there. And over here, there was a Dutch canal with fountains in it. So keep that image in mind there, and then this is at the same point now. That is the same point. Totally different. It may look like a natural landscape. It's not a natural landscape at all. What happened is Capability Brown came along in the early 1750s. He totally swept away that squared off garden, removed the lot, and he contoured it and landscaped it into a hill. I like Capability Brown landscapes, and I like that view. You've got to remember, Capability Brown, in creating that landscape, actually destroyed a perfectly good garden, which is why some people, not the National Trust, call Capability Brown a vandal. I'll leave you to make up your own mind on that one. And this is the Baroque mansion. This was built about 1690, 1700. In building that mansion, they removed the L-shaped extension entirely. It's a fairly accurate, but the indentations that we've got here, they're not actually that deep. And what we've lost is along the roof line here, there were figures and there was a dome over the roof there now. If you look at Petworth now from the park, it looks rather plain and not very exciting, like a row of terraced housing, really. But originally it had a dome there and statues all the way along there. Look very different. That's the marble hall there, which you're probably familiar with. Outside the marble hall, there was a turning circle, and we've done an archaeological dig, and that turning circle has been revealed. And then Moran railings beyond, and beyond that, there were formal flower beds. All that's totally gone. The not-so-marble hall. The story we tell visitors to Petworth changes over the years. We find we've been telling a story for 20 years and it turns out to be entirely wrong. And we have to revamp it. We used to tell visitors that the marble was white Carrara marble from Italy and the black marble came from Belgium. A couple of years ago, we had a Belgian couple at Petworth. So to make them feel at home, I said, black marble, it comes from Belgium. There was a pregnant silence and they replied that we don't have any marble in Belgium. Which rather upset my story. It does come from Belgium, it's not marble, but our stories do change over time. And that's the way it makes of it. Ornate but comfortable, well, not particularly. These chairs, normally chairs of this style are made in Italy, but these were believed to be made in England in the 1600s. They were waiting room chairs. You were not meant to be on them for very long, even without the pine cone there. And they were originally in the marble hall. They look very ornate, but a couple of years ago they were being restored. And I was talking to the restorer and he said, well, they look lovely, but actually they're shockingly badly put together and they could easily collapse. So they went for show, not for durability on that one. Now, why did the building of Petworth change radically from a simple building to a large L-shaped structure? For two reasons. The 8th Earl of Northumberland. He was an ardent Roman Catholic at the time of Queen Elizabeth. And he was involved in a plot to make the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots Queen of England. And he was put in the Tower of London. After a time, he's let out of the Tower of London on condition he paid a fine of £5,000. And he was told, you have to live at Petworth. So the family still owned Petworth, but they'd never lived here. Why? Because up in Northumberland, he had his own private army, he had his own power base, he could cause trouble. Down in Petworth, he had none of those, and the government in London could keep an eye on him. So he had to live down here, and he made a number of renovations to the property, including renovating the chapel. So he lived here for a few years, and then he was involved in a plot to make Mary Queen of Scots Queen of England. Let out of the Tower of London again after a bit. And then he was involved in a plot, you know what's coming next, to make Mary Queen of Scots Queen of England. He'd really done it this time, however. He had Mary's agent, an individual named Paget, staying with him for a week at Petworth, plotting and scheming. He wrote a detailed account of where the French army could land in support of Mary, highly treasonable activity. He was going to be put in the Tower of London, he was going to be tried for treason. He never was. He committed suicide. Well, the general public were not convinced it was suicide because all the reports going around were there were 2 pistol shot wounds in his heart. And they did wonder how he shot himself in the heart twice over. So the government set up an independent commission of inquiry, which confirmed he hadn't been murdered by the government and he had committed suicide. We'll never know what happened. He may have been murdered on the quiet by the state, but he may have committed suicide because if he'd been tried for treason and found guilty, and he would have been, all the family lands would have been forfeit to the crown, but by not being tried for treason, the family hung on to their property. On the other hand, he's a devout Roman Catholic and suicide was a mortal sin. So Perhaps not. I like the third possibility is that a relative came to visit him one day and killed him. Same reason, to protect the family inheritance. Either way, third time in the Tower of London was unlucky for him. However, interestingly, although he was a devout Roman Catholic, he realised which way the political and the religious wind in the country was blowing, and he had his son, the ninth Earl, brought up as a Protestant. Now, the ninth Earl, as a young man, led a riotous, extravagant life. If they had Ferrari motor cars in his day, he had half a dozen of them. He pretty well bankrupted the estate. But then he had a sudden conversion, and we don't know what it brought it on, and he devoted the remainder of his life to academic matters. He became known as the Wizard Earl, very interested in science, alchemy, astronomy. He was a member of the court of Queen Elizabeth. Towards the end of her rule, he was in correspondence with King James of Scotland to find out whether James would be more tolerant of the Roman Catholics. And James gave various vague assurances he would, but when he became king, they did not materialise. He got disillusioned with the court and withdrew to his homes, not to Petworth though. And life was going on quite happily for him until November the 4th, 1605. That day he had dinner with Thomas Percy, a relative of his. Nothing wrong with having dinner with a relative, is there? The only trouble was Thomas Percy had rented cellars under Parliament and filled them up with gunpowder. So Thomas Percy was up to his neck in the gunpowder plot. The government pulled in everybody who'd been involved in the plot the next day. They arrested him. They wanted to try him for treason, but there was no evidence of that. They then tried misprision, which really meant he knew about the plot, didn't tell anybody. That didn't work either. They came up with a few very minor charges, not really related to the plot at all, and locked him up in the Tower of London for 16 years. A long time, but don't feel too sorry for him. He wasn't in a damp dungeon with water dripping on his head. He lived in the Martin Tower. He had his own library, study, bedroom, bowling alley, food and drink bills over £1,000 a year, and he had 20 servants to look after him. So it's not too bad. And whilst he was in the Tower of London, he built up a huge library of 1,000 books, and we got 500 of those at Petworth today. A very, very valuable book collection. Whilst he was in the Tower of London, he had his daughter Lucy locked up with him. Lucy had formed a romantic attachment with a Scotsman. He did not like the Scots. The function of the Earls of Northumberland was to keep them out of England. So to break off that relationship, he had Lucy locked up with him, but she was quite a feisty young lady. She brided the dance, went in and out when she wanted to. And in due course, she married the Scotsman, who in 1622 persuaded the king to let him out of the Tower of London. He had to pay a fine of £15,000, equivalent to millions of pounds today, and he too was told you have to live at Petworth. He doesn't appear to actually have minded that because he got institutionalised after all that time in the Tower of London. He was not very sociable at that time. He could go to Petworth and devote his time to his books, so he wasn't unhappy with that. Now, it may seem that it was unreasonable to be locked up in the Tower of London for all that time with no evidence. The government may have been wise, because if the gunpowder plot had worked out, the gunpowder plotters wanted to make James's teenage daughter queen. She was not old enough to rule at the time. The obvious person to rule in her stead would have been him, so he would have gained from the gunpowder plot. And he lived here until 1627, dying on what date? The 5th of November. Not a good date for him, not a good date for him at all. Interestingly, his father had enclosed more land and made Petworth Park bigger, and one of the neighbouring farmers in Tillington objected to that and took the ninth Earl to court over it. It was a legal action that lasted 20 years. The tenant farmer won that legal action in the end, although he totally ignored the results, so the park remained enlarged. But what I find interesting is that in England at that time, an ordinary individual could take an earl of a land to court. That could never have happened in France or Spain, but it did happen here. And a little bit about the painting itself. He's wearing academic robes there. He didn't go to university, but it's how his son wanted to be remembered. It's a posthumous painting. And he's got his elbow there on a sheet of paper with a mathematical formula. And by the elbow there's an hourglass, maybe representing his time in the Tower of London. But that is probably my favourite portrait of Petworth. It looks like, to me, like a real individual there. But it is a posthumous painting, so we can't be entirely sure. So caught up in the gunpowder plot to some extent, but he kept his head and he kept his property, which is an achievement. His two boys played the political game rather better than he did. His eldest son, Algernon, which I'll come to in a moment, supported Parliament in the Civil War. His youngest son, Henry, supported the King. So whoever won the Civil War, the family would be on the winning side. And here they are, Algernon and Henry. Algernon. He was a member of the government of King Charles I, and he was Lord High Admiral of the Navy, but he had a problem with King Charles. King Charles believed in the concept of the divine right of kings. The king is appointed by God, he can do no wrong. And as the relationship between king and parliament began to break down, he moved more and more over to the parliament side. And when the Civil War began in 1642, he moved right over to the parliament side and he brought the Royal Navy with him, which is a big blow to the king. However, he was not a Puritan. He did not approve of the execution of King Charles. He didn't approve of later execution of the people who signed the death warrant on King Charles. He wanted nothing to do with the military government of Oliver Cromwell, and he withdrew to Petworth to build up his art collection. We had 4 great art collectors at Petworth, and he was collector number 1, and his great passion was Van Dyck paintings. If it's a Van Dyck painting, he wanted it. That was his great passion. Interestingly, his marriage was a very unusual marriage, his wife Anne there. It was a love match. People normally got married for dynastic reasons or to acquire more property, but it was a love match bitterly opposed by the 9th Earl because her grandfather was the one who had persuaded the king to lock the 9th Earl up for the gunpowder plot. Bitterly opposed by the 9th Earl until he heard the size of the dowry she was going to bring with her. Then all the objections vanished. Unfortunately, within a couple of years of the picture being painted, his wife and his daughter, Catherine, died of smallpox. Didn't matter how rich or powerful you were. He had no son and heir to leave the property to leave the title to, so he remarried and he did have a son, so the line carried on. And that's Henry, younger brother Henry. He supported the king during the Civil War. He was a great favourite of Queen Henrietta Maria. And when the Civil War went wrong, he moved over to France and he died in exile there. He wasn't a particularly effective supporter of the king. There they are. Although they were a family divided by politics, they remained united as brothers. He was about to be arrested for some acts he done just before the Civil War began, and his elder brother agreed with Parliament, just delay taking any action for a week to enable my brother to get out of the country. So they did remain brothers, even though they were divided politically. A royal burden. These are the younger children of King Charles I. We've got Duke of Gloucester, we've got Elizabeth there, and we've got James, later James II there. This is a painting by Peter Lilly. It was a painting to remind the king of what his younger children were like. When the Civil War began, the 10th Earl of Northumberland was given the task by Parliament to look after the children. They were really in protective custody. He was trusted by Parliament, he was trusted by the king. So he looked after royal children. Not a task he enjoyed at all, because they liked to be kept in the manner to which they'd been accustomed. It cost him, of course, a small fortune. And later on, he palmed it on to his sister to take them on. So those are the children. They are rather tragic with the children. Because the Duke of Gloucester there, he lived to the year of the Restoration, 1660, but died of smallpox. Elizabeth was a real tragedy. She was a very intelligent, very bright. She could read Greek and write Hebrew, Latin, very bright and intelligent. But she was imprisoned in Carisbrooke Castle. Parliament, after a time, decided she could leave there and join her mother in France, but she died about 3 days before she got the news. And we all know about James, Duke of York, later James II, who lost the crown. It's a very nice picture. And what I like about the picture is this picture is painted in the middle of the Civil War. The country was in ruins. Their mother they hadn't seen for years was in exile. Their father was in prison. They looked so assured, so self-confident. You get no idea from that picture of the turmoil going on in their lives at the time. And what happened, as I say, the picture is painted for the king. When the king died, Parliament no longer wanted a picture of the king. So the Duke of Northumberland, he got a boat from Syon House, went down the Thames to Hampton Court to collect it, took it back to Sion House, and in due course it arrived at Petworth. A power couple. Now, I mentioned that the Earl of Northumberland remarried and he had a son, and that son had a daughter, Elizabeth. He and his wife, then after that child had been born, went off on the grand tour to Europe. His wife was pregnant again. He left her in Paris and went on to Italy, where he had a torrid love affair with somebody, which was a scandal in Europe. To square it with his wife, he began to hurry back from Italy and died of heat stroke near Turin. His wife, when she heard he died, miscarried, and she'd been carrying a boy. So the male Percy line died out again. What we have left is Elizabeth, 3 years old, when her father died. Here she is, slightly older. She married the Duke of Somerset, the proud Duke that I mentioned earlier, who made the renovations to the chapel. However, she had 2 marriages before she married the proud Duke. Marriage number 1 was at the age of 12. It might seem incredibly young, but there was a good reason for that. She was the richest woman in England, probably the richest woman in Europe. There was a great danger in those days of an heiress being kidnapped and forced into an unsuitable marriage. So they tended to be married off young, about the age of 12, but marriage wouldn't be consummated until several years later. Her husband was a couple of years older than her. He went off on the grand tour to Europe, left her back in England, and he promptly died. So she was a widow at 12 or 13. Then her grandmother had to look round for another husband. Why her grandmother? Well, Elizabeth's father had provided in his will that if her mother remarried, she's to be brought up by her grandmother, because he did not want the new husband taking all the Percy inheritance. I must, however, call her the wicked granny, because she'd acquired a large number of gambling debts to very important men that she couldn't pay off. She needed to find a rich husband who would pay off the gambling debts. And she selected Thomas Finn of Longleat, who had an income of £10,000 a year, enormous sum of money. So she wanted Elizabeth, her granddaughter, to marry Finn. Well, the trouble was she could not stand him. He was over double her age. He was a rake, he was a roue. He was rumoured to have married somebody already, rumoured to have an illegitimate child by her, suffered from the pox. He's a gambler, he's just a bad egg altogether. She did not want to marry him at all. So after they'd been married for a year, he wanted to consummate the marriage. She didn't want anything to do with that. So she went shopping one day in London, went to the back of a shop, got on a boat, sailed down the River Thames to Holland to get away from him. He was absolutely furious. All London town knew his new young wife had left him. His anger was probably reduced, however, by the fact that she was abroad and he had controlled all her money. So that was not too bad for him, probably. She, however, now had an admirer, Count Königsmark from Sweden. The Count wanted to marry her. The only problem was she was already married. That was not a problem for the Count at all, however. He engaged a group of ruffians who had her husband shot dead in Pall Mall one evening. Problem solved. The Count could now marry Elizabeth. Well, maybe he could marry her, but she could never marry him. It was already rumoured that she'd been involved in the murder, and if she had married him, everybody would assume, yes, she had murdered her husband. So she could not marry the Count. So Granny had to look around again. Duke of Somerset. But he was only 5 years older than Elizabeth. He had no bad reputation. He was too totally boring to have a bad reputation. And he had no money, really. He never expected to be Duke. The previous Duke had been killed by a jealous husband in Italy. There were a lot of those days. But he was a Duke. Elizabeth had money but no status. They got married. She got the status and he got the money. And with the money, he built the building you see today, the Baroque mansion you see today in 1690. 1700 period. These are called kind of swagger portraits, actually. It's how people wanted to look, how they presented themselves to the world. It's not now how they necessarily looked. Now, they were what I call a power couple. You may know that Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough was a great favourite of Queen Anne. And when Sarah fell out of favour with Queen Anne, Elizabeth took over. She exerted a great calming influence on the Queen. If you wanted a favour from the Queen, you had to keep Elizabeth happy. How do you keep Elizabeth happy? By finding a job for her other useless husband. He's also fairly hot-headed. He was master of the king's horse at one time, which really is a cabinet appointment. And he got annoyed with something the king had done, so he told his servants to gather all his regalia together and dump it in the courtyard of St. James's Palace, and he never got another job. And you'll notice there he's wearing the robes of the Order of the Garter. Apparently, he used to go down to breakfast in the morning dressed like that. He was so proud of being a member of the Order of the Garter. Now, they had 4 boys, but the male line died out again. Their son is here, but he died fairly young. They had a daughter who married into the Wyndham family of the West Country, and by a complicated arrangement, that family were given the title Earl of Egremont, and our story of the owners of Petworth will continue with the second Earl of Egremont. But before we do, a little bit about the paintings. As I say, they're swagger portraits. Taking the paintings together, have you any idea who the Duke is pointing to? The little black boy? Most unlikely. That's the order the paintings are hung at Petworth. If you reverse them, he won't have his back to his wife, and he will be pointing to his son over there. We believe they've been hung this way as a bit of a joke, but there we are. The little black boy, servant or slave, we're talking near about 1700 now. Actually a servant. There had been a court case in Elizabethan England saying that slavery was incompatible with the laws of England. So as long as that little boy was in England, he's technically a servant, not a slave. And the other point I mentioned about the portraits, Elizabeth had very carrot-coloured hair. The artist seemed quite kind in only giving a hint of it there. So they were a very, very, very interesting couple. And it's to them that we owe the current building we've got now. A door to nowhere. See that door there? Leads nowhere at all. A number of visitors have noticed going around Petworth a door, and then they go into the next room, and the door doesn't go into the next room. They wonder what's happening. And all that's happening is they put a door in every corner of a room to give balance and proportion and symmetry to the room. This one leads to a brick wall, another one leads to a tiny cupboard, and others you can't actually open at all. But if you've got any annoying children in the carved room, I often show them the secret room. That keeps it quiet for a bit. The swaggering portrait of the swaggering king. Henry VIII in the carved room. Why have we got Henry VIII here? Well, the reason is that the proud Duke was his great-great-grandfather was James Seymour, Henry's third wife's brother. And he was part of the court of Henry, and he looked after Henry's son when he was a young man. And the proud Duke, when he came to live at Petworth, he wanted to make his mark on Petworth, so he brought that family portrait of Henry VIII with him. People often ask for that portrait, who painted it, and is it an original? 2 questions which are actually very difficult to answer. Henry's court painter Hans Holbein had died when this was painted, so we believe it was painted in Hans Holbein's studio by his pupil, so we don't actually know who painted it. Is it an original? Again, that's difficult to answer because it is the iconic image of Henry. It's the image we're all familiar with. If you go to other country houses, you get that image of Henry. So it's just a very popular image. Henry liked that image. Why did he like the image? Because it conveyed 2 powerful ideas about Henry. One, the strong, powerful king. He was not actually a strong, powerful king. He was actually quite weak. The other one is a strong, virile man. And by that time it's painted, he's not a strong, virile man. You don't paint your king as he really was. One visitor the other day said it reminded him of Donald Trump. And Henry, in fact, did own Petworth for a time, because the 6th Earl of Northumberland, going back in time for a moment, fell on hard times, and he had a relationship with Anne Boleyn at one point, which meant he was on rather dodgy ground with Henry. So he entered into a deal with Henry whereby he got an annuity of £1,000 a year, and Henry got all the Percy property, including Petworth. The deal was signed, Henry got Petworth, and the Earl promptly died, and never got any money. And when Henry owned Petworth, he did come here hunting for times, and he wrote on one occasion he had good hunting and recreation. What the recreation was, I don't know. A Bosch. That is 500 years old. I say, well, maybe. When the family acquired their pictures here, there were no professional art experts at that time. They didn't always get what they hoped they were buying. This is labelled by Bosch as a Bosch. A few years ago, they had an exhibition at Petworth. Brandy headed Bosch to Bellotto, but the experts on Bosch nowadays saying that probably not by him. The number of paintings that they attribute to Bosch, they keep on cutting down and down. Possibly not by him, but I think it's a wonderful painting. The building is really wonky there. It's a wonderful building. That's meant to be Jerusalem in the background there, but that's not quite how Jerusalem really is, but it's how a Northern European at the time would imagine it to be. It's in wonderful condition, isn't it? Because it's been cleaned not so long ago. The National Trust have a policy. If you want to borrow one of their paintings for an exhibition, you clean it, because it costs a lot of money. So that's how that happened. Now, a detail from the Bosch painting. The experts can't make up who that character is there. He appears to be up to no good. Some people say it's Antichrist, others a Jewish priest, others it's Herod. I like the idea it's Herod, the emperor without his clothes, take away his royal regalia, and compared to the Christ child, he's nothing at all, but people can't make up their mind. So any ideas on that are welcome. Doesn't show up too clearly here, it's a bit large, but what I do like here is the beaten copper pan there. It's brilliantly done. This is Joseph being sold by his brothers, by Bourdon, Sebastian Bourdon. But a detail from the painting, had the artist ever seen a camel? I think not. I think not. Mars no longer, and Venus. Rather bright picture, I'm afraid. This is a picture by Titian. We've got 2.5 Titians at Petworth. One is completely by him. This one is partly by him. We've got another one which featured on our TV programme a little while ago, also partly by him. Mars and Venus, they were lovers. And you'll notice that Mars has got his arm round the waist of Venus, and Venus has got her arm there, resting on his arm there. It got damaged at one point, and the original picture was not like that. We've got an X-ray of it. In the X-ray, the arm of Venus is raised, not down on his arm, and Mars's arm is under her bottom, not on her waist. We don't know why the artist made the changes. We believe it got damaged in Puritan times, and maybe the restorer felt the new version was slightly less rude than the original. We don't know. But it does show that many of the paintings here at Petworth have got a history to the painting themselves. Not merely what they depict. 50 paintings to the price of one. This always intrigues visitors here. This is by David Teniers the Younger. David Teniers the Younger was an artist, obviously. He had a father, David Teniers, who was an artist. And David Teniers the Younger had a son called David, who was also an artist. So it can get a bit difficult to separate who painted what. He was also an art dealer, and he's put himself in the painting there. And his patron is the Archduke Leopold there, and this is their gallery in Brussels. Painter and art dealer. He was given the brief to come to England to buy up what he could. At the end of England's Civil War, Parliament sold off the Royalist art collection. They didn't like the paintings, they were Popish, they were Roman Catholic. So he bought 500 paintings altogether, and these are just some of the ones he bought. All the way along there. And virtually every single painting can be identified. And he did 10 other versions of that painting to represent the 500 paintings he bought. So it is really 550 paintings at the price of one. Very interesting painting, that one. I've seen one of the other paintings in Vienna. I think one's also in Liechtenstein, and the others are scattered throughout Europe. A £30,000 spring clean. That is a very large painting by Reynolds in the square dining room at Petworth, the which is seen at Macbeth, Double Double, Toil Trouble, Fire Burn, Autumn Bubble. It was very, very dirty a few years ago. You could barely make it out, and they decided to have it cleaned. It's a very large painting, as you can see. They took it off the wall, took it on the floor, took it out of its frame, then it had to go out through a window. because it wouldn't go through the corridor. They put it in the removal van. That was fine. They took it to the artist restorer's studio in London, and then they couldn't get it in the studio. They hadn't measured that part. How they worked it out in the end, I'm not sure. Restored at a cost of £30,000. You can understand why the National Trust does not restore pictures too often. And it's a big painting, but even so, it's still a difficult painting to view. Not finished there. The witch is there. The evil witch is there. It was bought by the third Earl of Egremont from a bankrupt sale, and there is a watercolour by Turner in this room. It shows that painting in that position. So it's there when it's bought. It's still there 200 years later. Instantly, going back there a moment, a number of visitors comment, why is there not a dining room in the dining room here? Square dining room. It was not used as a dining room very often. It's used only for grand formal occasions. When the family were dining on alone, they dined in a room beyond there. That incidentally is a dummy door there. So not used as a dining room very often, but I find that rather not putting painting myself to have it as in a dining room, a bit gruesome. There we go. Now, a little detail here. When you see the different colours of paint there, strip, that's probably only about 6 inches long, in fact. The National Trust have gone back to when this dining room was built in about 1700 to reveal each paint layer after the other. There's a little detail a visitor will probably miss, but it does show us what's happened over the years. And the current paint layer is basically the paint layer at the time of Turner. The National Trust, as far as they can, present Petworth at the time it was at Turner. That's why they got that colour. Petworth Beauty, the beauty room at Petworth. Now, the beauty room contains a number of portraits of beauties who were part of the circle of the Duke and Duchess of Somerset, and they were full-length portraits. What happened was the third Earl of Egremont had one son who was at the Battle of Vittoria in the Peninsular War, and another son who was at the Battle of Waterloo. And he was very proud of that, so he made this room into a shrine for the Battle of Waterloo. It also contained a picture of Napoleon and a bust of Wellington. Now, to fit these pictures in, they had to do something about the beauties, and they shortened them. And can you see there, the front of the painting is the other side, and it's been folded over at the back to make the painting shorter. For a long time, we believed that what had happened was the painting had actually been cut off and the lower part destroyed, because we had an account written by the third Earl of Egremont saying, I don't want to see their petticoats, cut them off. But whoever carried out the work disobeyed instructions and actually kept the original painting, although damaged. And that's what the original painting looked like. So it was a full-length portrait originally. So what happened, they had an exhibition in London a few years ago now, just before COVID, and 2 of the paintings went to London for that exhibition, and they were cleaned for that and restored. So here is the painting, how we presented it for many years. On the left, you can see where it had been folded over, there. Very, very pale, and this is what they've done with the restoration. Brilliantly done, brilliantly done. You can just make out very faintly a line there. It's very, very faint. You really need to know it was there. And that is the Duchess of Devonshire. All these beauties have one characteristic, apart from actually not being particularly beautiful in my eyes. None of them have smiling. Probably their teeth were rotten, so that's why. They're also not wearing any jewellery. Again, that's another Petworth story that changed. We used to say that they were part of the court of Queen Anne, and they didn't wear any jewellery because Queen Anne had about 16 pregnancies that all went wrong one way or another. The court was in perpetual mourning. But then after more research, we found they were not part of the court of Queen Anne, they were part of the circle of the Duke and Duchess of Somerset. So why they're not wearing jewellery, we don't know. That's one of those oddities. Very old, very doubtful attribution. This is the oldest object we've got at Petworth. It's Aphrodite or Venus. It's about 2,400 years old. 2,400 years old. An expert in the 1800s said it was about Praxiteles, a famous Greek sculptor. The trouble with that attribution is that we've never actually found a piece that we can actually attribute to him as being a genuine piece by him. So it may or may not be by him. But from the hairstyle, we know it is about 2,400 years old. She's had a new nose job in that period, and her lower lip has been repaired. Originally, it had been a full-length, probably nude statue, but we just got that. It was acquired by the second Earl of Egremont, the grandchild of Duke and Duchess of Somerset, for the grand sum of £50. He had an agent in Rome who bought up lots of statues for him. Now, there's a great debate nowadays about returning art objects to the place of origin and so on. Were they acquired on a legitimate basis, whatever? Well, we hope the Vatican never asks for our collection back, because we probably shouldn't have them. What happened, the Vatican had very strict regulations going back to the 1400s about an archaeological dig. You needed a permit. You needed another permit to export any item from antiquity out of the country. We, however, have a letter from the second Earl of Egremont's agent saying, we found this wonderful statue. It's missing an arm and a head. If we find the missing parts, it's going to be worth £5,000. If we can't, we know a very discreet carver who will add the missing parts and then we'll ship it out on the quiet. So that's probably why we shouldn't have it. But, I'm sure the Vatican have got plenty. They don't do that. Grandeur and domesticity. This is the grand staircase. Petworth is largely 1690, 1700 building, but they had a fire in this area shortly after it, and this was remodeled at that time, done by Louis Laguerre, a Frenchman, painted on plaster. The main scenes depicted all around here: Pandora opening a casket and letting all the trouble of the world out. But on the left-hand side of the staircase, we've got this far more domestic scene, which is quite a contrast to the classical one. We've got the Duchess of Somerset there, driving in her chariot. We've got her 3 daughters there, and we've got the family spaniel there. And the idea of that mural is that she's making her way along there, round the corner to Petworth, because round the corner, you can't see it here, there is a drawing of a painting of Petworth. So that's that. So it's quite a remarkable contrast between the two. A few years ago, or more than that now, in the 1990s, the National Trust commissioned a report on the condition of these, and they were told to restore them. It cost several £100,000. That was over 20 years ago, so it costs a bit more now. I do like the family spaniel there. This is another scene from the mural. What's going on here? Looks a bit odd, doesn't it? What is going on here is there was a wall painting here, and they decided to put in a door, and the door ran up there to that point. So the head there would be left just above the top of the door. Later on, they blocked up the door, wanted to restore the painting. By this time, the rest of the painting got very dark and dirty. So the artist, when he restored it, painted this part dark. Later, the entire painting was cleaned up. This part would clean up, that part would not clean up. And the characters were originally both male, not male and female, and that leg does not quite work for a woman. Apart from that, it's a perfect work of art. But visitors, when looking at that, are often very intrigued at what's been going on there. This is part of the history of the properties. Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is probably the finest book in the National Trust collection. It belongs. Got a mind of its own. Finest book in the National Trust collection. We're not quite sure how the family acquired it. The preferred story that the second Earl of Northumberland was a great niece of Chaucer. It seems a rather remote connection to me, but anyway, the family had it for a long time. It was handwritten by one person, same writing all along, about 1420, 1450 period, shortly before printing came in. This was coming to the end of that period. What I do note about it is it's in remarkable condition, which would suggest that nobody's ever read it. And what we do with this, when it's on display, it's removed and displayed in the winter. When it's on display in the summer, we turn over a different page each day, so one page does not get exposed to light for too long. So if anybody here is studying Chaucer for their A levels, it might bring back happy memories. A Vision of Hell. This is by William Blake. I do wonder what was going on in his mind. Now, the third Earl of Egremont was a great art collector. These Blake paintings or etchings were acquired by his wife. So what we've got here is all people going up there to be judged, being judged up there. And the ones who haven't made it are tumbling down here. They've got snakes curled around their bodies. They've got chains behind their back, making their way down to hell down there. And if you look carefully, the devil is there. Chin, eyes, horns and horns, right in the middle of the painting. It's a remarkable painting. It's oil paint and ink as well. So it's the more you look at that, the more you see in it. Interestingly, there are adults and children going up there to be judged, but there are no children coming down the other way, so they're all innocent. This is a detail from it. There is William Blake, they're sketching there. And that is the third Earl of Egremont's wife with her children around there. We got two other Blakes here. One is quite ordinary, the other is totally bizarre. And I do wonder what was going on in Blake's mind at times. Constable's House of Turner. Constable gave Petworth the nickname the House of Art. The third Earl of Egremont bought a lot of Turner paintings. He never bought a single Constable painting. Constable stayed at Petworth very often, but for some reason, the only people who seemed to like Constable at that time were the French. So we've got a lot of Turner paintings. We've got 20 Turner paintings here. People often ask with the Turners, how valuable are they? It's only with Turners that they really ask that question. Well, a piece of wood and a canvas is worth a fiver. National Trust can't sell anything, so it's immaterial anyway, but we've got about half a dozen Turner paintings for the River Thames. And recently one was sold in the open market, not one of ours, of course, for £5 million. So you can do the mathematics. So they are extremely valuable. Turner and the third Earl of Egremont were very similar people. They're both rather boorish, unconventional individuals. Yes, that is a Turner. Not the usual Turner, is it? Jessica, Shylock's daughter from the Merchant of Venice. Now, the third Earl of Egremont was very different to his father, the second Earl. The second Earl collected classical statues. The third Earl commissioned new art. He was a patron of modern British art. If you're an up-and-coming British artist, you could come to Petworth, you didn't need an invitation. They'd put you up in one of the 80-odd bedrooms. You'd take any painting off the wall to copy it, take it to a room and copy it. And when you'd finished, you didn't say thank you for having me, you just left. Petworth was a bit like an artist colony. And one day at Petworth, probably they had too much to drink, the third Earl of Egremont, I was talking to Turner and other artists, and one artist said to Turner, I bet you can't use yellow in a portrait, because Turner and yellow paint was a bit of a joke. And Turner said to the third Earl, well, if I do it, will you buy it? And the Earl said, okay, you do it. So it was painted in London, delivered to Petworth, unwrapped in the presence of the Earl, who took one look at him and walked away without comment. That tells you what he felt about it. At least he did keep it. Turner never did another portrait, and the painting was totally hammered by the critics. One critic said, why is she standing in a mustard pot? Another, that Turner must have been suffering from jaundice of the retina, and a third, that only a great artist would have dared exhibit anything so bad. But it was done a bit of a joke. I don't know that Turner spent a great deal of time about it. Most visitors at Petworth don't like it. It's not my favourite, but it is nevertheless a Turner. One of our 20. The yellow paint there is meant to represent gold, Shylock. And that's from Punch magazine. That's a Turner yellow paint for the joke. So we've got Turner, big brush, big bucket of yellow paint, daubing with canvas. So. The dangers of conservation. This is a Turner painting, hulks on the River Tamar. Between the two wars, the then Lord Leconfield had the King's picture restored at Petworth to clean a number of paintings. His cleaning technique to lift off the dirt was to apply hot wax to the canvas. But it's lifted off more than the dirt. Everything is a horrid sludgy brown, isn't it? Turner would never have painted that. There's a little bit of colour in the rowboat there, being ruined. The King's picture restorer got the sack from the King, and Lord Leconfield never had another picture cleaned in his lifetime, so that's the result of that one. It would have been a lovely picture. It happened to two other Turner paintings, not quite so badly damaged. That one's really been ruined. We have some photographs of it before it happened, but they were in black and white, so they don't really help us. A painful memory, or perhaps not. This is another Turner painting of Chichester Canal. This is in the card room at Petworth. I'm not quite sure. These four paintings in the card room were commissioned by the third Earl of Egremont. We're not quite sure why he commissioned that painting, because he invested £50,000 in the Chichester Canal and lost a lot. Work started on the canal during the Napoleonic Wars. The idea was ships would go from the coast to London without going into the Channel and being attacked by French privateers. It wasn't finished until after the war was over. It never made any money. And there we are. But typical Turner painting, he's moved the cathedral to a different location. The canal was never that wide. You'd never got a boat that large in it. Apart from that, it's an accurate representation. And that may be Turner in the boat there, little rowboat there. We do know that he took a row, he did many paintings of River Thames, we got about half a dozen. And we do know that he took a rowboat down the River Thames with his sketchbook to, that may be Turner. A good news story. You may remember a few years ago, the National Trust were involved in a bit of a furore about slavery in the National Trust, and various properties that had a very tenuous connection with slavery were brought up in the publication. Well, this is good news. This is a painting of William Wyndham, a member of the family. It hangs in the North Gallery at Petworth, and he was Prime Minister at the time when the slave trade was abolished. Funnily enough, in the National Trust guidebook and brochure, it makes no mention of that good news, but it is. It's worth. I always like to point it out to people. A world transformed. If you haven't been to Petworth recently, you may remember the globe with a rather black wooden case. It's now in a case, new case, glass all the way around. It's got underlighting to it, and that is a very important historical document. It's a Molyneux globe. It's the very earliest English globe in existence, 1592. We believe it was acquired by the family, possibly from Sir Walter Raleigh, who was in the Tower of London with the 9th Earl of Northumberland. We're not entirely sure on that. An important historical document, because in the 1500s, Spain and Portugal dominated the exploration of the world. But by the late 1500s, England was beginning to take an interest, and that globe would have reflected that growing interest and would have encouraged it. So it's actually very important. It is also remarkably accurate. There's no Australia or New Zealand, of course. California is a bit dodgy. California is there, and it's shown as an island. North coast, west coast of America is generally a bit flaky, but it's actually very, very detailed. And a little story. Some years ago, I pointed out to a visitor the Maldives Islands, and I said that was a Georgian travel resort. And she said, "Oh, really?" And then she realised that I was joking. The world comes to Petworth. 1814. Napoleon had been defeated. Waterloo was still to come there, and all the Allied leaders are in England to celebrate. They'd been to Portsmouth to review the British fleet, and they stopped off at Petworth for lunch. So what have we got here? Some of the children of the third Earl of Egremont, the third Earl of Egremont there, Prince Regent George IV, the Tsar of Russia, and the King of Prussia there. It was not, however, a very happy gathering. Prince Regent had too much to drink. The Tsar of Russia did not know how to behave in polite society, and the King of Prussia tried to order everybody around, a bit like a Euro summit, I assume. But what I do like are these two characters at the back, looking at all the great and the good of Europe, with Petworth Park in the background. That's in the North Gallery. St. Michael killing Satan, stone in motion. This was done by John Flaxman in the 1820s Apart from the spear, it's carved out of one piece of marble. It cost £3,500 then, and probably at that time a good lawyer would earn, say, £500 a year, so 7 years' earnings for a good lawyer. And St Michael has got what they call a contrapposto pose. All that means is that he's got one leg there and the other leg is raised up, and that gives him the illusion you've caught him in mid-motion. I think it's brilliantly done, brilliantly done. And if you look at the detail of it, there's the veins on the arm and the hand there. Very, very done. Now that is in the North Gallery. An extension to the North Gallery was built by the third Earl of Egremont. Who would have been able to look at the art that the third Earl of Egremont collected? Obviously the Earl would have done, his family would have done, distinguished visitors would have done, and also the general public, if you were the right kind of person. In those days, country house visiting was not uncommon. You had to be the right kind of person. You remember in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet went to Pemberley, housekeeper showed her around. So you knocked on the back door at Petworth and they show you around. That practice died out by about 1850 because by then all the wrong kind of people were travelling around by train. Until then, not a very good picture if wanted to get it, difficult to get the right light. But there is the third Earl of Egremont. He had a great passion for art, but he also had a great passion for the ladies. A commentator at the time said he had 43 illegitimate children. That is a story that the Daily Mail and other newspapers and TV companies love to repeat. It's not actually true. It's probably about half that number, even though it's quite a lot. But what I do like is, and I'm sure it's been done deliberately, is there we've got Martin Luther, and there we've got John Calvin. John Calvin in particular was not a bundle of fun, so to hang John Calvin next to that reprobate character, I think somebody who's enjoying themselves with that one. A hospital for decayed statues. That was a nickname Petworth had, because these classical statues, when they were acquired, they were always broken. We would never change them now, we would leave them as they are. But at that time, they either added another Roman part they found or carved a new one. So what was this like? It was found in the River Tiber in 1750. The head, left shoulder and left arm, and half the back are new. That's new below the knee, that's new below the knee, that's new, and the line cover, whatever there is new. So simply they found the torso in the River Tiber. They called it Dionysus as the Greek god of wine, but they got actually no idea who it was. And they restore it and make it complete. If you're particularly observant, you'll notice it's not entirely complete. There's a reason for that. It was carved, the restoration was done in 1800, and by 1800, female nudity is acceptable in art, male was not, so that's why they didn't make it entirely complete. Unfinished business. This is a work commissioned by the third Earl of Egremont when he was in his 80s and he died. Prometheus and Pandora. What happened? The Earl died. John Crewe, sculptor, reckoned that he'd been underpaid on commissions in the Earl's lifetime. He took the Earl's estate to court. Legal action was a total disaster. He had to withdraw the action. He's made bankrupt. He went to debtor's prison and he stopped work on it. And if you look in detail, you can see the chisel marks there. Chisel marks there. That leg has been smoothed off and the other leg has not. So work stopped on it 200 years ago. So I think it's very interesting. It's showing work in progress. Woodworking as an art. Grimling Gibbons. The carved room at Petworth. You've got to be a little careful at the carved room at Petworth. Probably only about 1/3 of the carvings are actually by Grimling Gibbons. The National Trust are a little coy about that, but only about 1/3 by him. And this is the supreme example. We've got the violin, the viola, recorder down there, trumpet up there. There's a medallion hanging down there. We've got lace there. You see a book open there. That is Purcell's Fairy Queen, and you can actually read the music there. It's incredibly detailed, incredibly detailed. And it's carved out of lime wood and is layer upon layer of wood held together by glue or nails. And Grimling Gibbons charged 25 pence a linear foot, so you've got a pound's worth of work there. Peas in a pod. You see the open pea pod there? It may be an apocryphal story, I don't know, but the story is that Grinling Gibbons, whenever he did a carving, did a teapot closed, and if a patron paid him, he opened it up or had an assistant to open it up for him. I don't know if it's true or not. We've got two teapots at Petworth, they're both opened up. Some years ago, I went to a church in the city of London, and in one church, the teapot was closed and the adjoining church was open, so it might be a true story. It's good to ask children to point it out, but the inevitable reply is that they don't like these. Now, this is from a Japanese cabinet at Petworth. You'll notice the lock is upside down. Sometimes one of the commissions went out to Japan or China, they got things wrong and didn't have it at Petworth. And in that one case, the Western illustrator did a design saying, with an arrow saying green paint here. When the bars came back, the Chinese had carefully replicated green paint here, the wording. So they didn't always get what they expected to get. But copper and more copper. We've got a wonderful collection of copper in the kitchens at Petworth. The Victorians loved their dessert, and how you presented it was as important as the dessert itself. And, that is an annual task for cleaning. Volunteers used to clean it themselves, but now the staff do it. Perhaps we won't trust them to clean it, I don't know. This is the range and the servants' quarters here. The metalwork there is all late Victorian 1870s. The brickwork behind goes back to Elizabethan times. So this has been the range at Petworth from Elizabethan times, from certainly the time of the 8th Earl of Northumberland. The estate office. We used to do tours of the estate office. We don't now, unfortunately. It actually is very well organised. Each of the little labels here are the name of a local farm, and many of these names are still around. And in the cubbyhole there, they put the tenancy agreement, all correspondence, and a plan of the farm. So if there's any query about a farm, it's all to hand immediately. I think it's brilliantly organised. At the time of the third Earl of Egremont, when he died in 1837, there were 30,000 acres of farmland around Petworth, owned by the family. They're now down to their last 12,000. The beer cellar. Public aren't allowed in there. Now it's got the family's heating apparatus in there. But under basically carved room and the little dining room, there is a huge beer cellar dating back to the time, probably about 1620 period. Huge vaulted room there. Under Petworth House, running from one end to another, there are rooms and corridors everywhere. There's a real underworld world in that down there. The Summer Dairy, a place for work and play. Many of you will be familiar with the Summer Dairy. It was a working dairy, but it's also a very ornamental building. Why an ornamental building as well? Two reasons. In 1700s and 1800s, the lady of the house would often play at being a dairymaid. But also, we've got no evidence it happened at Petworth. It certainly happened at Kenwood, for example. In the little side rooms here and here, they would often hold tea parties. So it's not merely a working building, it's also a building for pleasure and leisure. Difficult to work out what you're looking at here, but this is one of the three chambers of the ice house, looking straight down. They were built in 1784, the three chambers altogether. They were built in under a year, and each chamber could hold 72 cubic meters of ice. Extraordinary structure. Far more ice than they could never have obtained. I believe it was built as a work creation project. And the ice, the idea of the ice was that you got the ice from the pond out there. The trouble with the pond ice was it was not pure and clean. It had bird droppings in, insects in it, leaves in it. You could not put it in your gin and tonic. You could, however, use it to make ice cream. You could use it to chill wine, red wine as well as white, because the red wine was often so revolting that if you chilled it, it tasted marginally better. And later on, from 1800 on, mid-1800s, they began to import ice from North America. But this is a summer dairy that we were looking at earlier. This building here, we'll run down, and then this is one of the chambers under the ice house. It seemed a very good idea to build the summer dairy above the ice house. The ice house helped keep the summer dairy nice and cool. Not a good idea at all. The summer dairy, they insulated with straw between layers of ice. The straw would rot, give off different fumes, and it would kill you if you remain in the summer dairy. So not a good idea. A pond or a lake? This is the pond opposite the house. It is called the upper pond, and the more northerly pond is called the lower pond. It should be the other way round. Why the one nearest the house is the upper pond, I don't know. A pond or lake? Well, about 1900, the bride-to-be of the person who was to inherit Petworth said to the then Lord Leconfield, "You've got a wonderful lake out there." And he replied, "Madam, when you marry into the family and inherit, you will own half the Lake District. Up there, they've got real lakes, that is only a pond. Compared to my garden pond, it's an ocean." A world under the park. Now, you know that Petworth Park is very much a managed landscape. They raise hills higher, they're filled in valleys. There are 4 or 5 kilometres of tunnel under the park. They bring spring water from Tillington, Nuppington direction down to the ponds. They're constructed in mid-1700s, faithfully Brown period. Trouble with them, you can actually stand upright in some of them. The trouble is that they're gradually collapsing. If you notice a line of sedge grass in Petworth Park, that's where it's collapsed. The National Trust have a long-term policy to build new tunnels, not to destroy these because they're archaeologically important. They're made of concrete. The trouble is it would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. It would all be underground. No one would ever know that they've been done. So whether the work will ever happen, I don't know. And there we are. And then iconic Petworth, the park, the Brownian landscape. The park is 700 acres large, and we have got about 700 fallow deer here. The fallow deer are one of the purest deer herds in the country. The herd dates back to when the park was first enclosed at the time of Henry VIII. National Trust say that no other deer have got into the park in that period. I'm sure 1 or 2 have, but it is a remarkably pure herd. And all the fallow deer, for example, in New Zealand, are descendant from Petworth deer. So if the Petworth herd were ever ravaged by disease, we could actually recreate it from the herd in New Zealand. They are wild deer, they're not farmed deer. They're left to get on their own devices fairly well when they have their young. There's no intervention at that point, the young live or die. They do have to be culled for 2 reasons. One, they can live to about 15 years old, but their teeth are worn out by the age of 8 years or so they can't feed themselves after that. But also they can increase their numbers by about 1/3 every year. But what we try to do is to find a new home for them. So a few years ago, a new deer park was established in Whitby in Yorkshire, and 100 or so Petworth deer went up to there to establish the new park. And so it's a rather nice view of the deer. We do deer rut walks in October each year. So if you're interested, do come on one of those. I do those too. How are we doing on time? Right, okay. Gone on a bit, haven't I? That is the final slide, you might be glad to hear. Okay, final slide. Has anyone got any questions?
When did the lake, which era did the lake form? Was the first photograph?
Well, the lake was formed by Capely Brown, but then at the time of the 3rd Earl of Egremont, 50, 70 years later, he enlarged the lake towards the road leading to Midhurst, so he made the lake bigger. It was always a watery area. We believe that before the lake was created by Capely Brown, there's an ornamental Dutch canal there, so it was always a watery area.
Not surprising, not many
Just as well as I overran.
You know, it's so long since we've been to Petworth House and seen the Turners, no Constables, and today's talk has really sparked my imagination again. What a lot of treasures there are in the house. I mean, there are 65 slides there of non-stop treasures. Ian, you're so knowledgeable, and you gave us such an entertaining talk. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of us all.